Welcome back to Lucore Automotive Services. We're standing here with the final edition of the Code 504 frame swap. We've had a lot of people ask about all the things we did to this truck, and that is actually a very long list because we did so much more than just the frame swap. This truck came to us and it had some issues. The frame was questionable. It definitely had really bad bump steer, which we were not able to overcome. Had a bunch of other stuff, bunch of oil leaks, fuel leaks, it just had lots of issues. So we decided to do a Code 504 frame swap, and that led into a bunch of other things which we upgraded along the way. I'm going to walk you around this truck and show you everything we did, all the stuff that's involved with the Code 504 kit, and all the extra little things we did to make this truck so much better and so much more comfortable to drive on the freeway in modern traffic and just make it a more enjoyable vehicle. So let's go. I'll give you pop the hood and start walking you through all this stuff. So when this vehicle came to us, it had already had a donor 80s Camaro front clip welded into the frame. With that, its engine, its transmission, its rear end, all that stuff was transferred over into this car. The problem is the stuff didn't work real well. So we ended up opting to do the 504 kit because the original frame was butchered up pretty bad. The Camaro frame had a Mustang 2 rack welded into it in a strange way, and it was welded into the front clip was welded into the frame in some less than optimal ways, so we decided a full frame swap was in order. And the owners of the vehicle had looked into Pro Touring chassis, which are, to the tune of 20 grand just for the chassis. But for what their uses are, a Pro Touring chassis under this truck is a bit excessive. And for most people, they're never going to utilize a Pro Touring chassis to its full potential. For cruising around, going to get dog food, going to restaurants and cruise-ins, you don't need all that. So we had found the Code 504 kit and we'd wanted to do one, and we discussed it with these customers, and they're like, man, that sounds like a great solution. It's not anywhere near as expensive as a Pro Touring chassis, and it still gets us better drivability, better ride quality, better braking system, better steering geometry. So, hey, great, let's give it a shot. If you've watched some of our other shows, you can see a lot more in depth of the things we did. So the vehicle came to us already with a firewall mounted brake booster. We ended up taking the S10 master cylinder proportioning valve, plumbing all new brake lines through the system, all new hoses, brake components, hardware, shoes, pads, and everything were replaced. Now I haven't actually cleaned under the engine bay yet because it's still a little dirty, so you'll have to roast me in the comments for not making making it as clean and tidy as it should be. But it's still like 99% of the way there. The engine was the engine that came in the vehicle. We decided to utilize it until a further time. We may update it in the future, but here recently I was dealing with the oil leaks that this engine had, and after replacing the oil pan and front cover and getting them sealed up correctly, I was able to inspect the inside of the engine. I found it has a new camshaft, new timing set. The cylinder walls look really clean, so I'm not really worried about the engine. I did decode the numbers on it, and it is a 3710 block, which should be a early 70s 350 block, so we're pretty happy with it and how it runs. I mounted a fuel regulator on the firewall because I'm running a 15-pound fuel pump in the fuel tank, and that returns all my excess pressure back into the tank while always keeping the carburetor fed. And after it sits for long periods of time, you turn the key on, you give it a few pumps of gas, and the thing fires right up, which is really nice. I did end up using the S10 headers because they were the easiest fit with the S10 frame. I did have to make a new steering shaft, and I moved the column outboard at the bottom a little bit to facilitate better geometry with the steering shaft to the gearbox. I did use an S10 Extreme gearbox. The original gearbox was leaking, so I decided to put an S10 Extreme gearbox in it, which worked out really well. Under the vehicle, we installed an S10 Blazer two-door rear mounted fuel tank. I custom made the fuel straps, and we used the S10 sending unit and fuel pump. I did end up putting a new differential cover on it because the one that was on here had some pinholes in it and it was leaking. So we replaced the differential cover, which allowed us to inspect the differential. It was very clean. It had some old fluid in it, but really nothing I was worried about. The Code 504 shocks mount up really nice to the Code 504 cross member, which that cross member I also used to mount my fuel tank to. We ran all new fuel lines and brake lines and fuel return lines. The exhaust is all custom built, and I dumped them out right behind the rear tires, which gives it a nice exhaust note and gives it that hot rod style turn down behind the rear wheels. We also did all new rear brakes, new rear wheel cylinders, bled the brake system out entirely. Moving forward, you can see our 4L60E transmission mounted up in there. New custom-made transmission cooler lines. Now it does have some drips of oil on it currently, but the oil pan had been leaking so badly that I ended up replacing the oil pan and front cover on it. And once I got that oil leak fixed, now it's just a matter of getting everything cleaned off and we should be good to go. All the front brake components are new as well. My lighting's not very good in here. I apologize for that. I'm sure somebody will roast me for that. I ended up using a power steering hose for the S10 application. It actually worked out pretty well. I used a adapter in the back of the original pump to bring it up to date from the 45-degree flare to the O-ring flare, and that was a pretty simple fix. You just change the bung out on the back of the power steering pump. I had to get a different adapter for the transmission shift linkage. Lots of little things. On most of my vehicles I've built before this one, I would use a 700R4 transmission to get my overdrive and my lockup TCC to get those engine RPMs down on the freeway. This one I decided to try a 4L60E, which requires a transmission controller, and in this case, because we're running a carburetor, it also requires the purchase of a throttle position sensor, which basically there's a, I think it was $130 or $140 sensor that goes in where your TV cable would go, and that gives you your throttle position sensor so that the TCU has a reference for that. It also plugs into tach and speedometer, and I don't remember the other stuff. It's been a while. So anyway, you get these guys hooked up and you program into the controller the things you want and the line pressures you want and the shift points and our engine tachometer shift points and whatnot. And then you have a really nice automatic overdrive truck that you can, I mean, I was cruising this thing at 73 mile an hour and the engine was only turning 2,850 RPM. The wind noise in this thing running down the freeway at 73 miles an hour was pretty horrendous, so I ended up getting some soft seal door weather strips that are actually self-adhesive. So you clean the inside of the door, you wipe it down with some alcohol and peel and stick the weather strips on, and it cut down the noise and the doors rattling while you're running down the freeway. It actually made it so much more comfortable to ride in. I tried a few different headers. The Chevy V8 headers for a 88 to 99 full-size truck looked to me to be the best to use, but you have to do some modification to either the outlet or to the frame, and you would want to do that before you do anything coating your frame. I think those would be a great set of headers to use, but they do require some frame modification to fit properly. I ended up just using a standard set of Jegs V8 S10 headers and made everything work around those. They fit perfect. There's no need to adjust anything or make any big changes. And it keeps your exhaust nice and tight to the engine and transmission going down through the chassis. One of the things that was wrong with this truck when it came in was it had never had a speedometer that worked, and it never had a fuel gauge that worked. So those two things can make it not real comfortable to go on long drives. Well, we overcame both of those problems. This vehicle had Classic Instruments gauge sets in it, and Classic Instruments has, I call them filters, I guess. Basically, they've got little boxes. They've got one for the speedometer, and it takes the information coming in, and you can program it for whatever signal it's receiving, and then it gives a proper output, and then the speedometer, it goes in between your sensor and your gauge. Basically, in my case, the transmission control unit has an output for speed sensor, and you can program it to be a certain output in like 8,000 hertz or 16,000 hertz. And the filter from Classic Industries takes that input, and you flip a few dip switches to program it for what it is, and then it makes the gauge work. So that was a pretty easy thing to overcome once I figured out the right recipe of things to be dialed in. And the fuel gauge was the same thing. The fuel gauge gave me some problems. So the gauge didn't work when we got it. And then I tested it, and I could sweep it. So the brand new fuel level sender that I got from Dorman had a bad sending unit. So I had to pull the tank back out, put another sending unit in it, which wasn't a big deal. Dorman sent me the sending unit was a lifetime warranty, so I called the company I purchased it from. They sent me a brand new one in like 3 days, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. But it was a little frustrating because I'm like, man, everything should be working, but it's not. Well, you got a bad part out of the box. You gotta figure out what the wrong part is. So anyway, Classic Industries has a fuel level sensor filter, and it takes whatever sending unit you have in your car, and there's a whole list of them, and you can even put in a custom range if you want to do a custom range. So for the Classic Instruments gauge sets, these filters allow you to use any fuel system and program it so that your fuel gauge works, which is pretty nice. I'm pretty happy with the Classic Instruments components that are in this car. There's so much stuff we did to this. There's so much more than just doing a frame swap. It's kind of hard to remember it all now. But I am extremely happy with the outcome. I may actually drive it home again tonight, just because it's kind of what you do. You get to enjoy the fruits of your labor. One last shakedown run, so to speak. It's been a fun project. I'm glad it's over, and I'm glad I could share some of the knowledge that I learned on this process with you guys. Hopefully it helps some of you guys out there in your garages doing this project. Things I highly recommend on this kit: the engine setback plates are a must. Do I prefer the early frame to the late frame? I personally prefer the late frame, which is boxed more, but it creates more work because you have to make access holes to put your hardware on. So the earlier open C-channel frames are easier to do the job but I feel that the later frames are a stronger frame, and even though it's a little more work to make the stuff work, I think it's worth it in the long run because you'll have a more rigid frame. Well, this brings to a close our Code 504 project. I hope you have enjoyed the process and the information we have shared with you along the way. I learned a lot with this project, and I'm happy I was able to share some of that information with you guys. This isn't the normal work we do in this shop. This one we kind of took on because we wanted to help this customer through a situation, and I'm glad I did it. I would see myself using this kit again in the future. I'm real happy with the ride quality, the interchangeability of parts, the availability of inexpensive parts. There's lots of different ways you could go with the fuel system or the engine and transmission setup. You could certainly fit an LS down in here. With all the work we did to set this up for a small block Chevy, if the customer was to choose to upgrade the engine down the line, honestly, I would drop a carbureted crate motor Chevy 350 back in a hole. It would be quick. Everything's already set up for it, so it would just be pull the engine out, put the engine in, put it back together. It's all set up for a small block Chevy. Small block Chevy looks good between the rails of this thing. I don't think I would take this truck to LS power. There's probably, if I was going to do one of these with an LS, I would probably set some things up differently. But every vehicle is different, and every vehicle has its own set uses. And this one is being set up for cruising, going to car shows, and going to get ice cream. So it is what it is. It'll do that job very well. Well, again, thanks for watching. Click like, subscribe, leave us a comment below. You guys have a great day. Now get back out in your garage, get to work. You got something sitting out there, you know you do. You guys have a great one.